There was a circus that came to town, and my dad... Can I start over?
Of course, sir.
Ma and pa type restaurants that I go to that do a bodacious, I mean outstanding chicken sandwich.
Okay.
So it's all about taste and prep and presentation.
I'm just gonna let you run with it.
You shut me up whenever you want. You steer me wherever you want to steer me.
Let's roll. All
okay.
Right,
My dad was in World War II with a buddy, Leo Bradshaw, and when they got out, they went to the ordnance depot over at Fort Lewis, and they worked there. And they sold the surplus stuff out of the ordnance. They bought a piece of land. They had a 30 by 60 building built and sold surplus stuff from the Army. And the name B&I is Bradshaw and Irwin. My dad bought Leo Bradshaw out in 1949 or 1950. And my dad had a quirky issue in his life, and that was parking. The people down on South Tacoma, which were the people that was the shopping district, who had the old, where the building is right on the street and you had two-car parking right in front, thought he was crazy for buying perfectly good land and then cover it for parking. You know, you don't need any more than 2 cars in front of your store. And so years later, he had the largest parking lot in Pierce County. And that's when a circus came to town. And the circus was looking for the largest parking lot. And so they asked my father if they could use our parking lot. And he said, yeah. And that's what changed the entire direction of the store. Was his craving for parking actually was the catalyst to change everything about it.
My dad had no education, and he ended up very prominent, and hard work. He had, if you want to call it PTSD, he was wounded in World War II on Normandy Beachhead, and the bodies piled up, and he was underneath them, and he was shot, and nobody could find him for 9 months, and my mother finally, the Red Cross finally found him, and he had no knowledge of who he was, and it was I remember when I was tiny, he used to have that, I guess, PTSD, screaming and yelling. And so he came a long way from what happened to him to the way the BNI ended up.
You have to understand the time when, in 1946, we didn't even have televisions here. You know, they hadn't even hit the market. So the people stayed to themselves, they went to church, they had a simpler way of life, which was one of the things that made the BNI successful, is that they were starving for any form of entertainment. When my dad came in and he started doing some of the things he did, people would flock from all over to come here because there really wasn't any other option. There's, you know, the TVs in the 50s had just started to hit the market, so you know, they were looking for things to do.
It was a full retail store, and you could purchase anything you wanted. Everything was there. There wasn't anything left out. We had hardware and garden and lumber yard and shoes and clothing. We were the largest at that time, and we were union, and so we were at that time bigger than Penny's at the mall, and bigger than most of the stores at the mall. BNI is sitting on a 20-acre piece of property, and it had 5 buildings on it at that time.
Well, I was pretty much born and raised in the store. I can't remember the first time I walked in the store. I'd been there all my life. Every edition I was there watching or helping with the additions of the store. We added on probably a dozen different times to that store and ended up about 200,000 square feet. Well, we geared everything for the kids. We had popcorn, sold thousands of popcorns. Every weekend we'd have a clown. Saturday and Sunday we'd have a clown and giving balloons away and doing magic acts. And there was always something. There was always that air of excitement in there. And so you go in there and you're always going to see something new. There's sea lions or porpoises or lions and tigers and bears. So it was a fun place to grow up.
My dad spent all of his time there, and my brother and I didn't get to see him much. And so if you went to the store, you would see my father, and that was home.
We had a lot of local celebrities, Stan Borson and God, I can't remember all the different ones we had local. And then we had Cisco Kid, which was the first time anybody from Hollywood had ever done a shopping center outside of Hollywood. You know, they always did things in that area, but never went to a shopping center like Cisco Kid did. And there were people from all over counties came from there. All different counties, they'd come to that thing. It was just amazing how many people came to that, to see Cisco Kid.
And when we had Batman, and not Batman himself, but his sidekick, Bert, same thing. There was like 20,000 people came out to see him. And it was a place where you could go and you could lose yourself in the store with all of the animals and all of the decorations that were there and the circus atmosphere. I think that was very important to Tacoma.
Still have fond memories. I hear that all the time, still now. It drew people from all over. I don't think there were too many people that grew up in Lakewood at that time that hadn't been in there.
This is another story. The BNI kept getting broken into, and we couldn't figure it out. So the police came out with their dogs, and they couldn't find anybody hiding in the BNI every single night. So my dad and I went and we stayed in the store one night, and we couldn't figure it out. We had the security systems were by the ground, and it was lights, and all the lights went like this all over the store. And we hid out. We couldn't figure out what was going on. And then all of a sudden, we weren't looking, we were looking at the main doors, and all of a sudden we could hear ruff, 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 and here comes the seals. And the seals went underneath all of the lights. How they knew, I don't know, because you couldn't see the lights. They went underneath all the lights, and then they went up to the main door, and they knew where the light was, and they went whoa, 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 and they just ran back and jumped in the pool. Now that was funny because it went on for weeks and we couldn't figure out how to do that. You know, how they knew where the lights were and how they knew to put their fin up there by the main door and then run back and not touch anything and not even set off any other alarms and jump in the pool. I don't even know how they got out of the pool.
What my family was like on a typical day-to-day is like none other you've ever heard. We owned a pet shop, and the pet shop had a zoo license, which meant we could have all sorts of exotic animals. So we had Himalayan sun bears, we had 7 different lion cubs, we had 2 leopard cubs, we had probably 15 to 20 seals, harbor seals, sea lions, elephants, tapirs, chimpanzees, a couple of gorillas, and plus we had a small display of some exotic animals, coatimundis, capuchin monkeys, gibbon apes. What was our typical day like? It was bizarre. It was a day in the jungle. Earl Irwin, who owned the B&I at the time, asked my father to kind of up the game of the B&I circus store theme. About the only thing we had never had was a great ape, which the gorilla is part of that family. So Earl approached my father and said, "Rube, let's find a way to find some gorillas. Do you know how we can do that?" And my dad knew an animal importer, Morgan Berry, who had mentioned earlier. And Dad reached out to him, and Morgan said, "Yep, you know, I'll make some phone calls," which he did. A couple days later, he calls back and says, "Jeff, I've found a male and a female infant in the Belgian Congo that we can have here straight away." So the deal was made, money was exchanged. Earl purchased both the male and the female, Ivan and Burma. If you didn't catch it, B for Burma and I for Ivan, so we named him after the B&I itself. And again, the purchase was made, and they were both imported from the Belgian Congo via air freight. Unfortunately, Ivan was lost in Chicago for 7 days in a freight terminal, and it was very, very cold weather. So when he finally made it to the SeaTac airport, he was extremely dehydrated and truthfully not expected to live. We didn't think we were going to be able to bring him back to health. He was in such bad condition. So Mom literally took him in her arms and woke up every couple of hours to make sure he had a little nourishment. He was warm, he was cared for, and Mom literally nursed him back from the edge of death. Had it not been for her love and her commitment, Ivan probably wouldn't have survived. Once he got back to health and he began to play and kind of explore his world, keeping in mind that my folks worked 12-hour work days, 6 days a week, and a 10-hour day on Sunday. So when they were at the store, Ivan was with them at the pet shop. So we would get home 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, and we'd have a quick supper. And that was Ivan's time to have this huge rumpus room where he could just explore and run and create all sorts of havoc. And that's when we would play, Ivan and I would play our hardest games. We'd wrestle, we'd fight. We would just generally have good times. So his family life, the time in the house was usually chaotic because he was constantly in motion. He had 2 speeds, fast and sleep. That was it. There was nothing in between. So when he was home and awake, the energy level was incredible.
We caged him when he was about 5 years old, in this type of cage right here, like that, and it ended up being his bedroom.
The point we realized Ivan was simply too large was his level of playful destruction had gotten so catastrophic that we simply knew it was time to put him in a permanent enclosure where he could play as hard as he wanted, but not be as destructive as he ended up being. Not maliciously. He was never maliciously destructive on anything in our home or in our lives. He just had this wild energy and had such tremendous weight to strength ratio. He didn't understand how powerful he was. He would have been a great fullback for the Seahawks.
He was the largest virile male in the United States at this time, and he was very special. Everybody loved him, and they all told him his secrets, and he seemed to answer.
Well, Ivan's relationship with his caretakers, again, he was such a people person that he really made some very, very strong contact with his caretakers. They were his friends. They were the people that actually got to physically interact with him. He got to reach through and touch and feel, and obviously they were also the source of his food and his nutrition. So his relationship with them was really one of survival, and that develops its own level of trust and significance. Bob Doherty came into the picture just kind of, I really don't know all the details about that, but his significance was that he interacted with Ivan on a very primal yet a very social level.
The first time I saw Ivan was probably 1968 when my buddy Joey and I went up to the B&I Circus store at 8012 South Tacoma Way. And it was a very unusual store, and I was in, I think, 7th grade at that time. And Ivan was a major attraction there. Several years later, I was married, and my wife was working at a store adjacent to the B&I, and so I would continue to go and see Ivan. And by that time, I was teaching anthropology as a cultural anthropologist at a nearby community college. I got to know Ron Irwin a little bit, and in 1985, so the time has passed quite a bit there. In 1985, I approached Ron, and I told him I was not Diane Fossey, I was not Jane Goodall, I was a cultural anthropologist, but could I please work with Ivan to give him some kind of play and stimulation? And shocked the heck out of me, but Ron said, yes, you can. He did stipulate that I couldn't go in with Ivan, which was not what I planned to do anyway, so there was no conflict there. And so that started in 1985, about 5 or 6 years of me visiting Ivan several times a week and coming up with really stupid things to do with him to stop him from just taking naps, watching people stare at him. Silverbacks do not like people staring at them. And so just tried to give him things to divert his attention. This photograph was taken as a promo for the Urban Gorilla by a photographer who set up his equipment. And Ivan was in a very good, playful mood. And this is actually me, and that's Ivan, just in case you couldn't tell the difference between us. And this is a wall of bars separating us. And this is a very typical painting session. I've slid paper and paints underneath the bars to Ivan, and you can see his hand there, and he is painting. And if I was lucky, he would slide them back to me, as you can see he has done there, that picture in the background. At first it was a smear the paint and then keep it to himself and rip it up, and then I would give him a treat of food if he slid it back to me. And then I would give him another one. Sometimes he wouldn't paint at all. Sometimes he would do one. Sometimes he would do 4 or 5 in a setting. But it was just one of those things, what do I do today? Yesterday I did tug of war. The day before we raced. So it was just another, what does he feel like doing? Obviously, if he didn't feel like doing something, he would not do it. You cannot make a silverback do something that they don't want to do.
Well, a lot of people grew up with him. I mean, a lot of people my age that literally grew up with him. They'd come in 3 or 4 times a month and just go back and see Ivan. Thousands of people. You know, when you get the influx of McCord and Fort Lewis, and they change all the time, it's not a static group of people. It's, thousands of people that change all the time, and they come in and see him. And it made an impression on a lot of people. In the late 70s, everything kind of changed. in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, to have a gorilla in the store, to have an elephant or lions and chimps and all that, it was really accepted. There wasn't any problem with it. But the late 70s, things changed, and it wasn't accepted anymore. And so the late 70s, I started to move all the different animals we had. We moved all the lions, we moved the chimps, we moved everything, we pretty much got out of everything. The only one that we didn't move was Ivan. And Ivan by now was in his late 20s, and I had called every zoo on the West Coast that had gorillas, and some of the ones back east, Atlanta Zoo, where he ended up, and nobody wanted an older solitary gorilla. And I went to the SSPA for gorillas, species survival program for gorillas, 2 different times, trying to find somebody that would take Ivan and or find a mate for Ivan, and then we'd approach it a completely different way with a whole outdoor compound. And I couldn't find either one. I couldn't find a mate or anybody that was interested in Ivan, being an older solitary gorilla.
Paws became involved with Ivan because society changed. What was perfectly okay in the 1960s was not okay, societally okay, in the 1980s, and as you got close to the 1990s.
There's a misconception in the animal community that independents can't do as good a job as a zoo can. I've been in a lot of zoos, dozens and dozens of zoos. I grew up, my dad used to take me to Disneyland, and we'd end up in the LA Zoo or the San Diego and end up in the San Diego Zoo, and he'd trade recipes and he'd trade different ways to handle the animals, and he'd buy animals and trade them and sell things. And so I know what the bowels of a zoo looks like, and it's not as pretty as you think. It's not anything like what you think. Independents can do a good job, like Penny Patterson with Coco. She did a wonderful job, but all the people in the zoo industry say, oh, you can't do a good job because you're an independent. Well, we did a fabulous job with Ivan. We had a USDA permit, a zoo permit. He'd get a physical every year. He was in the top 5% health-wise, and one of the most mentally alert and very well adjusted. That's the word I wanted. Adjusted, very adjusted.
They didn't take into consideration the level of care, the level of love that Ivan was showed on a daily basis. So it was a bit disruptive for Ivan, I think, in that he ended up being transferred, and bless his heart, he made the transition eloquently as I hoped he would.
So Paws became interested in putting pressure on the store to take Ivan away. Before the airing of the Urban Gorilla documentary, there was absolutely no chance that that would happen. So all of this happened after the Urban Gorilla.
Have you ever had a person that you work with that you just feel you're not on the same wavelength? Somebody's got an agenda behind it. And this person got me involved with the Urban Gorilla. And it was a movie about urban gorillas. And it really turned out to be more of a hit piece than just explaining Ivan and seeing the situation and the good things, constructive things that we're doing with Ivan.
The Urban Gorilla was the thing that changed Ivan's life, because when you watch that documentary, everything is positive in that documentary except that one gorilla in the store in Tacoma. That was a very, very sad segment of the documentary. He had this stupid anthropologist that was hanging bananas from strings from the ceiling and playing tug of war with him, but that didn't add to the positive nature of the Ivan segment. So once the Urban Gorilla documentary aired, the Dallas Zoo, I believe, was the first zoo to say, "We will take Ivan." That changed everything. Obviously, it took years for that to happen, and he didn't go to Dallas. He went to Atlanta. But the Urban Gorilla is really what put Ivan on the national level, not just a regional phenomenon. Paws then realized that if there was a chance to get Ivan out of there, they would work very hard to do it, and they organized the protests and the boycotts and that type of thing.
In the middle of that, I get a phone call one day, and my secretary called me up and says, there's a lawyer on the phone from California. Well, at that time, I was on speed dial with about a dozen different lawyers. It was kind of an interesting time back then. And I answered the phone, and this lady was on the phone. He says, I have a client that is interested in acquiring Ivan. And really? And she said, yes. And then the logical question is, who's your client? And she said, Michael Jackson. And so I said, Michael Jackson? He says, yeah. He says, in the conversations that followed this thing, he said that he would make the best gorilla compound on this planet, and he'd get a mate. And when somebody of that stature says something like that, you have a tendency to believe him. And so he started off to get the design, and he got the design for the cage, or for the compound. He lives in Santa Barbara. Neverland is in Santa Barbara County, and it's very liberal down there. And he had a very difficult time getting a building permit. And he had 3 attorneys. They went to court 4 times to try to get a building permit. So after 2.5 years, the lawyer finally called up and says, we just simply can't get a building permit. We got to stop the whole process. They won't allow us to have it. So at that time, I've got Paws sitting out here that's, picketing me every weekend. I'm getting death threats. They're throwing nails underneath all the cars in the parking lot. We're getting bomb threats, But when Michael Jackson got involved, and then when Michael Jackson stopped in the involvement, that also hit the press. Yeah, we were called every name in the book. We went through a lot. Hundreds of terrible letters. How evil we are. And I was wondering what I was going to do next, and then it dawned on me, well, I got the most famous gorilla in the world. And I says, somebody is going to want it. And then the phone started to ring. And all these people that I had talked to earlier that didn't want my old gorilla are all calling, saying, oh, you misunderstood me. We'd love to have Ivan. We'd love to have Ivan. Well, finally, Atlanta called me, Terry Maples, and he said, you misunderstood what I said earlier, a couple of years earlier. And he was the place, Atlanta Zoo was the place that I originally wanted him to go. I thought they had one of the best programs for Ivan, for gorillas. They had 24 gorillas, which seems like a lot, but they had the best program, and that's where he ended up.
I don't think the involvement of Paws ever really became clear to him until he was put in a shipping crate. One of the photographs that one of the TNT photographers captured of him was his eyes looking through 2 holes that were bored in one of the panels in his shipping crate. And I saw his eyes, and I saw the bewilderment in him about, what's going on? Why are you doing this to me? What is this all about? And I still have a copy of that picture and look at it from time to time and just wonder to myself what was going through his mind. And how confused he was to be taken away from what he knew to be his existence, and he had no idea where he was going. So I look at that picture, and it's always a bit hurtful knowing what he was going through.
The most important thing out of Ivan's story is clearly that you can have an amazingly traumatic infancy, because Ivan was captured in Africa, probably with his family being killed, transported across the Atlantic, taken across the North American continent. So you can have an incredibly traumatic infancy. You can have an incredibly nice childhood, which he had with the Johnstons. He was a star of Tacoma. He was a member of the Johnston family. You can then have an incredibly traumatic and dramatic transition from member of a human family to stuck on display in a store, and then spending decades stuck on display in a store. And you can do that for 30 years, having experienced those benchmarks in your life, and you can be perfectly healthy physically and mentally. The biggest surprise I had when I first started working with Ivan and got to know him as he was getting to know me was that he had a very stable personality. He had a very set things that he liked, things that he didn't like. He was very consistent. So I think from a psychological point of view, it was amazing that he was as well-grounded as he was. When he then moved to Zoo Atlanta, he had adjustment problems because he had never been around other gorillas since his infancy in Africa. So the females in Atlanta realized they were dealing with the silverback, who was a nice-looking guy, but he didn't know how to act like a silverback. So they stole food from him. They bullied him. They pushed him around, which in the wild is absolutely unthinkable. Females would never think of doing what these girls were doing to Ivan. Eventually, he learned to stand up to them, and so they stopped bullying him, but he never made it. And that perhaps is one of the regrets, that he did not get his genes into the captive gorilla population before he died. And the main reason was, I think, that the females realized that he was a bit of an oddball in terms of not having learned how to be a silverback. A young male gorilla in the wild watches older brothers, watches dad, watches uncles, learns how to be a silverback by being a blackback first and watches. Ivan had none of that experience. So Ivan didn't know how to be a real silverback. Physically, he was magnificent. Socially and romantically, he never stood a chance.
Ivan was somebody that I had always known and grown up with, because he was 10 years older than I was. And so he was always a huge part of our family. In 2012, when he had passed away at Zoo Atlanta, my sister and I had traveled to his memorial service over there at Zoo Atlanta, and I was moved by how he affected all the people in that community, just as he did over here in ours. I was inspired to actually try to do something so he would always be remembered. And so therefore I kind of talked my family into doing this statue of him. 4 years after that, in 2016, we then dedicated his statue in October here in Point Defiant Zoo and Aquarium right here in Tacoma, Washington. And one of my favorite photos was of him when he was first released into his new enclosure at Zoo Atlanta, where he was holding this magnolia flower. To me, that photo meant, goodbye, I'm gonna be okay. And I thought it was probably the best photo that you could use to memorialize him in this way, creating this beautiful monument.
One of the untold stories of Ivan was the fact that we had a female gorilla that we got just a week before during Ivan's missing time in Chicago. Burma was the female that we had purchased, and when Burma arrived, she made an instant connection with my mom. It was like, Mom, I'm your daughter, we're connected for life, and this is just how it's going to be, because I really love you, and you're the center of my world now. Burma was with us for about 5.5, 6 months, and she got very, very ill. And when we had the two of them together, they were wonderful playmates. Ivan was never expected to live. Burma showed up in great health and just a really prime specimen. So it's ironic that about 6 months into us having the gorillas, Burma became very, very ill. It was like a very severe flu, if you will. And took her to the doctor, numerous visits. We really couldn't figure out what was going on. She was finally diagnosed post-mortem with a disease called infantile intestinal thrush disease. And that's what caused her demise. Of course, the family was devastated when we lost her because she was such a gentle, loving little creature, so unlike Ivan. She would be quite content to just sit in a stack of blankets that she had made a nest of, and just be there, just be present with the family. She didn't need to be entertained. She didn't need to be roughhoused with. In her death, it was very difficult for all of us because we loved this little gentle spirited member of our family. And although it's unconfirmed, and I've tried numerous times to research with the University of Washington, the story goes that we donated Burma's cadaver to the University of Washington, and through the research on her body, they were able to find a cure for this particular strain of intestinal thrush. And the story goes further to say that in her death and in the intervening actions with the University of Washington's research, they were able to, even to this day, save countless lives in South Africa through Burma's passing. So her legacy is unspoken. It's never been reported. It's never been shared with many, many people. But, you know, her love just keeps going. And her legacy is that she's saving lots of lives to this day. So her contribution unspoken, but tremendous. What I got to say.